The following program is brought to you by the Center for Educational Outreach at Baylor College of Medicine.
A leadership presence is something that you establish from the moment you enter a speaking venue. People start collecting impressions of you from the moment they recognize that you're the one who's going to be talking. So if you are scurrying around in a haphazard way or looking frantic or panicky, they are picking up on that vibe. So you want to make sure that you approach a speaking engagement full on with a leadership presence. And by that I mean standing up, focusing your energy on the audience, not on yourself or your anxiety. Pause before you start talking. You don't want to be messing with your laptop, pulling up your slides, getting your handouts together. You want to pause and make sure that you have people's attention before you get started. You want to make sure that your eyes are on the audience. Limit movement, right? I'm not standing up here nervously stepping around. And I'm speaking with some authority, right? I'm speaking to the person sitting in front of me as well as to the person in the back row. I'm trying to encompass everyone in that opening moment. And I have pictures here of Steve Jobs. He's recognized as a very good presenter. And what I want you to notice is he's holding props. This might have been what generated your question. But notice that even though he's holding a prop, all of his attention is still focused out on the audience, right? He's not staring at the phone. He's not staring at the monitor. He's looking out at the audience, even though he's holding up a toy. Notice how his stance is open, his shoulders are down and relaxed, and his chin is up, right? A nice, open, accessible posture. So yesterday I mentioned that your audience is primarily listening at the beginning of the talk and the end of the talk, right? And what I didn't mention is what people are attending to at the beginning and the end of the talk. And it turns out that it's really not so much what you're saying, but how you say it. So 80 to 90% of what an audience recalls about a presentation is how it was delivered and not the message itself. So it's so important that you don't dismiss delivery as window dressing. Delivery is very crucial to your effectiveness. And it's a function of stance, gestures, eye contact, and voice quality. And we're going to look at each one in particular, and I'm going to get you involved in the process. So let's start with stance. Everybody on your feet, please. Lisa just mentioned that she has commonly observed people who sort of stomp their feet while they're talking. This is happening. People who cower behind the lectern or the podium. Right? If you are standing behind a podium, especially if you're only 5 feet tall like I am, you need to move out around it so that people can actually see you. And some movement is good. I don't want you to stand like a statue in one place. Some movement is good, especially for those of you who have a need to move around a lot when you're speaking. But you want to move with some intentionality. For example, when you're explaining a slide, you might want to stand in one place while you finish that explanation. And then if it's a moment of transition in your talk, then you might move to the other side of the screen or just move forward a step. Okay? So some movement is good. It makes you appear more dynamic. It gets people's eyes engaged. That's why I was doing it yesterday. In addition to stance, gestures are important. This goes back to some of the question that Jose asked earlier about what do you do with your hands? Well, a few things not to do. One is to fidget, right, with your fingers or with the laser pointer. If you're using a laser pointer, you don't want to be circling things, right? This makes people feel nauseous. You want to point and hold it long enough for people to see it and then let off the trigger. And if you are someone who has a lot of tremors in your hands, right? Some people's anxiety comes out in their hands, then you don't want to use a laser pointer, right? Because then suddenly everybody sees it and you are hypersensitive to it. In that case, you would want to use the features in PowerPoint, like an arrow that flies in to draw attention to a particular feature on a slide instead of using the laser pointer to direct people's eyes. Don't put your hands in your pockets. It looks a little bit too casual. It looks like you're hiding something. You don't want to be flipping your hair, putting your hands in front of your mouth when you're talking. How does this look? Bossy, right? This reminds me of my mother in high school, right? This kind of aggressive stance. You don't want to put your hands on your hips if you're trying to establish rapport with the audience. How about this?
Not interested.
Right, not interested. This is actually considered a defensive gesture. Right? I'm creating a physical barrier between you and me. Right? I'm closing myself off to you when I cross my arms. Gripping the podium like it's a life raft for a white knuckle ride. And then going back to Jose's earlier comment, this we refer to as the fig leaf. Right? Think Baroque painting. Right. You don't want to be drawing people's eyes down below your navel if you can help it when you're presenting. Your hand should not go behind your back. In North American culture, this sort of suggests that you're hiding something. And it also throws your shoulders back in a fairly formal, stiff way. So what do you do with your hands? Like I said before, a good stance, they're just nice and loose at your sides, but that doesn't mean they should stay there, right? Gripping your thighs, for example. Nice and loose, and when you want to gesture, because gestures are good for emphasis, and they are good to visually reinforce your verbal constructs. This is especially good for teaching visual learners who are less oral. So you can use gestures in a number of ways. The first I mentioned was for emphasis. A power gesture is an obvious example, the vertical slice, right? Or the gavel, right? I'm coming down vertically to make a point. Even a thumbs up is a vertical gesture. Concept gestures are driven by the nouns you're using. Like I heard Eleanor say to her group earlier, 3 times, bing, 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 right? I'm gesturing, bing, 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 3 times. I'm reinforcing that visually. You might ask your students, is it a triangle or a circle, right? You might say option A or option B. You want to get your hands involved, but when you're not using them, you want to drop them back down. Because a lot of miscellaneous hand movement just distracts. Right, so you want to use your hand with purpose. Process gestures tend to occur on a horizontal plane. Right? I just made a gesture, just intuitively, right? A horizontal plane. So first, second, third, for example. Then I want you to think about the position of your gestures. Good gestures should occur sort of below your chin and above your waist, right here about chest level. The reason being that that's where people can see them and still make eye contact with you, right? If I'm talking about a ring of nodes, then I can make eye contact with Angelica and she can see my ring. If my ring of nodes is way down here, then she can't look at both places at once easily. Or I've seen people give really weak emphasis gestures way down here by their hip. Like, this is really important. Yeah. That doesn't do it. You got to get your hands up where people can see them.
I see that with students a lot. You'll see that when students have to stand up in front of the kids, that the hand gestures are all down by their thighs.
Right. Encourage them to get their hands up so they are visible. And the last point I want to make about hands has to do with the scale. So the size of your gestures needs to be scaled for the size of the space. So if I'm in a small conference room, I can refer to a ring of nodes. If I'm in a big auditorium that seats 250 people, then I have to draw my ring of nodes in the air, right? Or go like this. I can't do this and be effective. So you have to scale your gestures for the size of the space. Eye contact is the most powerful delivery trait for North American cultures. And I keep saying North American culture because these behaviors that I'm encouraging you to adopt are culturally bound. Right? There are places in the world where it would not be appropriate, particularly for a female, to be making eye contact with a male. So I want you to keep this in mind, that appropriate gestures vary by culture. But in North America, eye contact is how we establish trust and credibility with an audience. So you don't want to be turning around and staring at the screen, right? When I turn my body to face the screen, I not only send the message that you're not important, right? I'm not paying attention to whether you're engaged or not, but I'm completely blocking off these people's view. And be aware as you think about your presentation for tomorrow how it's a natural tendency when your title slide is up to turn around and read it, even though it only has the title and your name's on it, something that you should know. There's just this natural temptation to turn around and read it. So I want you to fight that by keeping your body open to the audience. Keep your eyes focused out. Eye contact should be direct. By that I mean, you can tell if I'm looking at you in the eye, right? Somebody may have told you in the past that it's okay if you're uncomfortable making eye contact to look over the tops of people's heads, but I would suspect that you can tell if I'm looking over the top of your head or looking in your eyes, right? Right. So it needs to be direct. It needs to be sustained. Not a staring contest, but you should look at someone long enough to finish a thought and then look at someone else. Right? So you want to sustain eye contact and not have these quick glances. I've seen people before look at the screen, they glance out at the audience, and they go back to the screen, they glance at the audience, and they go back to the screen. And the audience can sense that they're not really making eye contact. And last, it needs to be distributed. So there are times when I'm purposefully looking at people seated way in the back of the room, way over on the right, and way over on the left. You need to try to reach out to people in different parts of the space at different times in your talk to make everyone feel included. And the last feature of delivery I'd like to talk about is voice quality. Voice quality is right up there with eye contact. Because speaking in an authoritative tone, again, enhances your credibility. So you want to obviously adjust your volume appropriately for the size of the space. A general rule about pace, by pace I mean the frequency at which you're talking, is that you usually want to speed up through details and then slow down for key points. That's a general rule. If you are explaining a very complex graph, you obviously don't want to speed through it because nobody will get it. Right? So it's a general rule. But in general, you do want to just speed up through details and examples and then slow down to emphasize what's important. Inflection has to do with highs and lows in your voice. It's like giving words special treatment, as opposed to speaking in a monotone, flat fashion that just puts people to sleep. If you are someone who tends to be fairly monotone, if someone has given you feedback about that before, then I suggest that you take a newspaper article and you go through and highlight important words and you read aloud to emphasize the key words as you're speaking. And you do it into a tape recorder and play it back so you can hear yourself. Articulation has to do with the precision with which you use language. I watch a lot of undergraduates who use vague reference, and it drives me nuts. For example, they'll point at a line graph, and it has 3 lines on it. And they'll say, this line shows that if you increase the amount of serum, then it increases the growth rate. This line, there are 3 on the graph. I don't know which one the student is talking about. It is just a follow-on vague reference. It's very hard for the audience to follow you if you don't speak with precision. And then fillers. You guys know what I mean by fillers in speech?
You know.
Like, Like. I would have you team up with someone or watch your DVD after you present for this program and count how many fillers you use. to be more self-conscious because we often don't even hear ourselves use them.
We're too busy panicking.
And people are stunned to discover that they said like 30 times in 3 minutes, or you know. And 2 other features of voice quality I want you to be attuned to that are more typical of female vocal patterns. And one is upward intonation. That's where someone says something that's a statement, but because they inflect upwards at the end of the statement, it sounds like a question. Right? Let's say, for example, it's raining outside, and I would say, it's raining outside? It's raining outside? Or our results show? Right? This upward inflection, women are much more prone to doing that than males. Something else that women tend to do is ask tag questions. Tag question is an okay or a right on the end of a statement. Our team should get started planning its presentation, okay? Right? Most studies of men and women's speech patterns would show that a male is more likely to say, let's get started planning our presentation. And women will tack on a tag question at the end. So I want you to be aware of these speech patterns because those undermine your authority. And men occasionally use those patterns, but they are more likely to be seen in women. So a few examples here that you have in your slides for inflection. So I want you to do this with me on 3, okay? I want you to inflect up on the word unique. So on 3, ready? 1, 2, 3. We have a unique opportunity. Okay, now we're going to go down. So on 3, 1, 2, 3. The performance metric is unacceptable, right? Drop your voice down. And here's a list. Lists are really tricky, and I want you to think about lists because if you read a list in a monotone fashion, people can't pick out distinctions in the data. So I'm going to read this first, and then you can do it after me. Enrollment increased by 3% in 2006, 10% in 2007, 12% in 2008. You notice my voice is going up both on the percents and the years. Right? I'm pushing my voice up so that people can hear those differences in the phrasing. Okay, so on 3, I want you to try this. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Enrollment increased by 3% in 2006, 10% in 2007, 12% in 2008. Right? You can't start too high, because if you start too high, you run out of room. Okay, then I want you to see how changing the emphasis can change the meaning of what you're saying. So I want you to emphasize the word that's underlined in blue. Ready, on 3. I never said you should ask her for funding. I never said you should ask her for funding. I never said you should ask her for funding, right? It changes the meaning and the implication. So I want you to really use your voice like an instrument. And last about speech, sloppy speech. When you look at a printed document, I'm just going to grab this one that's handy, there is typically a white space between words, right? People need to hear the white spaces between your words. Think of it as oral punctuation instead of slurring words together. And that usually requires hitting the final consonant of a word. Listen to the people on public radio and you'll get great examples of enunciation. They have a lot of training. Ed Mayberry is on top of it. Instead of gonna, you want to say, I'm going to. Right? Instead of I'm gonna, I'm going to. Or instead of are made, it's are made. Right? Audience needs to hear the white space between the words. And then don't overlook the use of a poignant pause for effect. Right? So despite our efforts, we were unable to get good data. Right? By pausing, I'm emphasizing the effort that was put in. Or no other school has this resource. Right? No other school has this resource. So use your pauses for some dramatic effect and occasionally just to let the audience catch up with you. So that wraps up my advice on delivery. I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about question handling, because you recall yesterday I said some people can give a great prepared talk, but then they fumble the Q&A and it erodes the leadership credibility that they've established. First and foremost, if you're giving a high-stakes presentation, you should spend as much time preparing for the Q&A as you do for your talk. And I would prepare several backup slides for that purpose, so that if somebody asks a detailed question, you can just hit the button and pull up a slide to help you talk your way through the answer. When the Q&A starts, you generally want to either stand your ground, now I'd like to take your questions and comments, or move forward. Now I'd like to take your questions and comments. Either way, you're trying to get close and establish a relationship, appear approachable to people. And when the Q&A starts and someone asks a question, listen. Right? Don't pounce on the questioner and interrupt and start answering, even if you've been asked the question 100 times before. Be gracious and allow that person to finish their question without interruption. In a big space, you need to repeat or rephrase the question so that everybody hears it. Make sure that you don't get defensive in your body language. What typically happens in a Q&A is the person finishes speaking and says, and now I'd like to take your questions. Right? I showed you that yesterday, right? I backed up 2 paces and threw my arms across my chest. This is very common when the Q&A starts. It's a retreat gesture. So watch that body language. If you don't know the answer, don't bluff. You get yourself into a lot of trouble if you bluff. And last, wrap up well. So you might be fielding questions about your project, and okay, so this, I saw the website is about science learning and a leadership collaborative. And you're fielding questions from your colleagues, and then suddenly someone says, stands up and they say, I participated in a learning collaborative last summer on the robotics and artificial intelligence, and what do you think about robotics? Right? They ask you a question that's really off topic and beyond the scope of what you prepared. You don't want the audience walking out the door thinking about robotics. You want them thinking about what you just delivered as your key points. So you have to bring people back to your message. In that case, I would say robotics is really beyond the scope of what I was prepared to discuss, but I'm pleased that I had a chance to speak to you about the value of the Science Learning Collaborative and the website that's available for your use and the benefits that you'll gain by using it, right? You want to bring people back on message so that they walk out thinking about what you had to say and not what the crazy person had to say about his or her experience on robotics. In most cases, the agendas that drive questions are really genuine, and people just want more information, or they want some clarification. Or maybe you talked about a program, but you didn't come out and make a specific recommendation for a course of action, and so they just want to push you to have you go that extra step. But there may occasionally be situations where you have someone who sets out to embarrass you or to invalidate what you're saying. And if you find yourself dealing with somebody hostile, this is what I want you to do. First and foremost, I want you to keep your cool. Right? When you are leading the Q&A, you are in control, and don't you forget that. Somebody might be hostile and might try to engage you one-on-one, but you have control. Don't think that because they corner you in an aggressive way that suddenly you're the victim. You're not. You can control the interaction. So 1, keep your cool. Think before you speak. Take a breath. 2nd, restate that person's hostile question in a neutral way. This is huge. Right? If somebody said to Dr. Moreno, wasn't that problem solved 20 years ago? Right? That's a hostile tone question. right? It's supposed to put her on the defensive. Then she needs to keep her cool, and she needs to say, no, this problem was not solved 20 years ago, right? She neutralized the tone. Or if somebody said to you, why would you do it that way? We did it this way because, right, you neutralize the tone. You make direct eye contact in the beginning with the person who is taking you on. But you don't stay engaged with that person, right? You start talking to that person, but then you want to open up. And by the time you finish speaking, you want to break from that person in a very obvious way. You want to, let's imagine, what is your name? Sarah. Sarah. Let's imagine that Sarah is attacking my talk.
Boy, that'd be hard to believe.
So let's just imagine it. I would start looking at Sarah in my response, but then I would turn towards the end of my talk and focus on Bill, who is on the other side of the room, right? I've turned my body and my eyes to the other side of the room as I finish up so that I break from her and she's not going to engage me again. And if you do get locked in with someone, then again, you need to maintain control and you need to say, I think it would be more productive if we discuss this after the session. There are other people here who have questions. And then you look at someone else. And someone will step up, right? Because that kind of interaction isn't productive for anyone. No one enjoys being witness to that, participating in it. So this is how you should handle the situation if you get a hostile question. But remember, tough questions and hostile questions are not the same. And if you get a tough question, don't evaluate it. Don't say, that's a good question, which is what most people do. Right? If you get asked a question that you don't know the answer to, the first thing people will say is, that's a good question. Don't evaluate the questions, in part because let's imagine that Sarah had asked me a question earlier and I didn't say that to her. Well, her question wasn't that good, I guess. Right? That's the implied distinction. And second, everyone knows that people only say that to buy themselves time. So don't do it. Don't do it.
So what would you do?
What would you do if someone asked you a tough question?
Not prepared to answer.
Well, then you might say, I need a minute to think about that. Or you might say, I haven't had a chance to really think about that. I'd like to get back to you with an answer. If you will give me your contact information, I'll follow up with you. If you really want, if you're in a community kind of setting, you can always put the question back out to the group. You could say, for example, I haven't really had a chance to think about that. Is there anyone here who would like to respond? But you have to be prepared to rein control back in if you do that. But it can be very effective, and it really does seem gracious, and like you're more invested in the group's understanding than your own ego when you do that. I want to cover the last couple of slides very quickly so that you have the last 30 minutes to work on your presentations a little bit. I know that you mentioned earlier, Lisa, that she's going back to present to a very large group of people. And usually when we have to do that, people we don't know in a large group, it's an anxiety-producing moment for most of us, myself included. Even though I get up and teach people how to give talks, it doesn't mean that I don't get nervous. Because I have a lot invested in it. I want to do well. I want to share what I know to help you improve. And whenever you have those kinds of expectations on yourself, it creates pressure. So anxiety is natural, but I want you to think of that anxiety in a positive way. I want you to think about how adrenaline can make you more alert and more focused and not derail you. And one of the ways that you might do that, is one, scope out the venue in advance if you can. So you two, if you can, go and practice in that space so that you get comfortable knowing where you're going to stand, imagining what it looks like filled with people, moving around in that space. That's very important. Second, visualize success. Don't undermine your own performance with negative self-talk like, oh, I'm going to bomb this, or, oh, the last time I gave a talk, people fell asleep. No, I'm prepared and I want to do a good job. Focus on the audience, not on your anxiety. remember that audiences come to learn something. All they want you to do is they want you as the presenter to give them something of value, right? They're giving up their time to you. And if you deliver, they're not judging you negatively. So focus on the message and delivering something of value instead of on your own performance. Avoid caffeine. Don't think, I'm going to stop by Starbucks for that double espresso so that I'm really amped up and charismatic. That's a bad idea. Caffeine and adrenaline mixed, bad. And what I find most helpful for relieving anxiety is deep breathing. And I'm not going to lead you through this right now, but it's the first bullet on this slide. This is a deep breathing exercise where you inhale and in your head silently count to 8. You hold your breath for 8, and you exhale on 8. And you need to do this for 3 to 5 minutes. You don't do this as you're walking up to the podium to get started speaking. You need to practice this like you practice a talk, so that you have a sense of how long it takes to get your heart rate down. And I assure you, if you try this, you will feel so zen and so composed that the presentation will go much more smoothly. So I highly encourage you to practice the deep breathing exercise. The other exercises listed here really have to do with your ability to project your voice. So they're similar but a little bit different because you're actually vocalizing as you exhale. And nothing improves performance like practice. Practicing out loud 3 or 4 times is what enables you to develop fluency, right? Wrapping words around those bullets that are on the slide. It helps you manage your time better. When you practice, I would encourage you to have people watch you to get feedback, or videotape yourself and watch it later. And again, breathe. You need to be relaxed to do well. So just to wrap up, high-impact presenters. They size up the situation in terms of audience and purpose, as we talked about yesterday. They organize a compelling argument based around 2 or 3 key points. They use slides to support the message, not as a substitute for the message. They deliver with confidence, and they field questions in an open, accessible, confident manner. And these are the kinds of presentations that I hope to see tomorrow and on Thursday.